Montague Rhodes James was born in Kent, England in 1862, the son of a clergyman, though from the age of 3 he was raised in Suffolk. The family lived at the rectory in Great Livermere, which a century and a half earlier had been the childhood home of the antiquary Thomas Martin, nicknamed Honest Tom Martin of Palgrave. Whether the course of M.R.James's life, namely his lifelong interest in the past, was inspired on some level by Honest Tom's ghost is not, alas, recorded. Instead, it was a toy Punch and Judy set, as James recalled years later, that first gave him a taste for the ghostly. One of the cardboard figures among the set was called the Ghost. James went to study at Cambridge, where he would spend much of his adult life, first as a student and then as a Don. His scholarly achievements are less widely known than his ghost stories, but he was a notable academic who catalogued virtually the entire collection of medieval manuscripts at Cambridge University, and was an influential director of the Fitzwilliam Museum at Cambridge for 15 years. James's interest in all things antiquarian and medieval fed into his ghost stories, which he would read to his fellow Dons on Christmas Eve. In many ways his ghost stories are traditional in their form, at a time when his contemporaries, such as his namesake Henry James, were writing tales that treated the supernatural with skepticism and ambiguity, as in Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. M.R.James tended to adopt a less equivocal line in his treatment of the supernatural. When a linen sheet billows in an M.R.James story, there usually is a genuine ghost beneath it. If you're looking for a place to start, O Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad remains one of his most celebrated stories and typical of James's ghost stories as a whole. In 1918, he became Provost of Eton College, where he sat on the interview panel for a young boy named Christopher Lee, who would later portray M.R.James for the BBC. M.R.James received the Order of Merit in 1931 and continued as Provost until his death in 1936.
Every great story starts with a journey, and for us it starts on the North Norfolk Railway, a location much loved by filmmakers shooting period melodrama, and of course a featured television location for A Warning to the Curious, as directed by Lawrence Gordon Clark. Our intention is to explore the vexing question: did M.R.James believe in the paranormal? Much of what has been reported suggests that, on the surface at least, James had an open mind, due largely to numerous of his own brushes with experiences either preternatural or which could be interpreted or misinterpreted as such. Despite what was surely an intellectual wrestling with the possibilities, James never publicly made any admission to such beliefs. Our view is that he did, and we hope to convince you that there was so much more depth and secrecy to the character of James, which has largely been left unexplored, and that his own experiences greatly contributed to his work in the realm of the paranormal. And if M.R.James is considered the father of the modern ghost story, then Lawrence Gordon Clark, the highly innovative BBC director of many of James's successful television stories, and Jonathan Miller, who directed the earlier BBC production of Whistle When I Come to You, My Lad, are certainly the masters of interpretive landscaping with their wonderful yet almost minimalist productions brought to the delight of viewers on the small screen across the English-speaking world. And so we focus on two stories for our investigation: the original text of O Whistle When I Come to You, My Lad, and A Warning to the Curious, as well as on Whistle When I Come to You, which Miller produced in 1968, and the later production by Clark in 1971 of A Warning to the Curious. We will show you why the original locations were moved elsewhere along the East Anglian coast, and why these interpretations actually sit much closer to the spirit of James's storytelling, which I'm sure the great man would have approved of.
Walk away from the sea and the town, past the railway station, and turn up the road on the right. It is a sandy road, parallel with the railway, and if you follow it, it climbs to somewhat higher ground. On your left, you're now going northward, is heath. On your right, the side towards the sea, is a belt of old firs, wind-beaten, thick at the top, with the slope that old seaside trees have. Seen on the skyline from the train, they would tell you in an instant, if you did not know it, that you are approaching a windy coast. Well, at the top of my little hill, a line of these firs strikes out and runs towards the sea, for there is a ridge that goes that way, and the ridge ends in a rather well-defined mound, commanding the level fields of rough grass, and a little knot of fir trees crowns it. And here you may sit on a hot spring day, very well content to look at blue sea, white windmills, red cottages, bright green grass, church tower, and distant Martello Tower on the south.
My entire life fascinated by ghost stories. I grew up in Chicago in the United States, and even as a young girl I remember going to the library, and the only books I would take out were books of ghost and horror stories. And I would ask the librarian, how many can I take out? And she said, as many as you can carry. And I remember walking home from the library with the books stacked up to my chin, and they were all ghost stories. So I was very surprised about a couple of years ago when I saw a video posted on Facebook that linked to a video on YouTube that was by the so-called master of the English ghost story, M.R.James. I had never heard of M.R.James. Of course, in the United States, when we think of ghost stories, we think of the great master of American ghost stories, Edgar Allan Poe, and all of the people that really wanted to be just like him. I'd never heard of M.R.James. So I watched the video link, which was a link to the now I know is a great M.R.James story, Warning to the Curious. And from that first viewing, that first listen, I was absolutely enraptured by this story and by this writer. And I wanted to know everything I could about him. I wanted to read every story that he had written. I was surprised when I learned more about M.R.James that there seemed to be a feeling that he didn't believe in ghosts. and had never had a paranormal experience of his own, because for me, in reading his stories and listening to his stories, it came across to me as someone who's been a paranormal researcher for almost 35 years, that he was speaking from a perspective through his characters of someone that had had a very personal experience with another dimension, another layer of experience, that sixth sense. And so I couldn't really wrap my head around the idea that he was just writing stories with no personal experience of these things. And as I learned more about his life and got interested in the details of how he grew up and how his mind developed and his life developed, I began to see in the details that there were very specific experiences that James had, which he interpreted as dreams, nightmares, things in his imagination, which I feel could have actually been experiences that he had with the paranormal at locations where he lived or worked, or that he actually had a sixth sense of his own, that he actually had some kind of psychic functioning that he was aware of from the time when he was very young. There were very specific circumstances like this that we see throughout his life. Very early on in his life in the rectory at Great Livermere as a child, he talked about having vivid dreams of a ghost coming into his rectory bedroom. I got a book last year that was a book of letters that had been compiled by the daughter of a dear friend of James. And in one of the letters, James writes to her that he had a vivid dream recently when he was staying at an inn while visiting a friend. And in the dream, he had been woken up by his bedclothes being pulled off of him. And he began saying the Apostles' Creed and some other prayers related to that. So very, kind of harrowing experience that he greeted with a religious response. I think too, so many people have these dreams, or that they interpret them as dreams, but that dreamlike state that we are often in when we have these experiences, I think that's another possibility for an actual paranormal experience that James might have had. So we do have a string of experiences throughout James's life that suggest to us that there was something that was ongoing in James's life beyond his own imagination. I cannot connect, and I know a lot of people can't, the medievalist whose writings and even travelogues of Suffolk, Norfolk, and the surrounding areas are so dry and so matter-of-fact and just mere catalogs of things, with the depth of experience, the imagery, the emotion, and the horror.
Despite his illustrious lifetime achievements as an academic, James is better known today for the series of wonderful ghost stories which he wrote to entertain students and academics at Cambridge and at Eton. Much of his inspiration for these stories originated here in Aldborough in Suffolk, and during his lifetime, this quatrefoil defensive structure known as the Martello Tower would have stood looking relatively the same, and certainly would have been a place that was all too familiar with him. The tower was constructed adjunct to the now lost village of Slowden between 1808 and 1812 by Royal Engineers to the design of a Colonel Twist and a Captain Ford. In 1931, the Ministry of Defence sold it off to the wealthy Mitford family, who were among those who spent holidays here after it was converted into a home, but over time it fell into disrepair until in 1971, when it was acquired by the Landmark Trust, who restored it and have made it available for us to use today. There used to stand an old gun battery just north to the Martello Tower and virtually intact into the 1860s. But by the time of the 20th century, and at the time of James's penning of a warning to the curious, the battery was a crumbling ruin. And here at the Martello Tower is where Paxton met his end from the enraged spirit of William Ager.
You don't need to be told that he, Paxton, was dead. His tracks showed that he had run along the side of the battery, had turned sharp around the corner of it and smalled out of it, must have dashed straight into the open arms of someone who was waiting there. His mouth was full of sand and stones, and his teeth and jaws were broken to bits. I only glanced once at his face. At the same moment, just as we were scrambling down from the battery to get to the body, we heard a shout and saw a man running down the bank of the Martello Tower. He was the caretaker stationed there, and his keen old eyes had managed to descry through the mist that something was wrong. He had seen Paxton fall, and had seen us a moment after running up. Fortunate this, for otherwise we could hardly have escaped suspicion of being concerned in the dreadful business. Had he, we asked, caught sight of anybody attacking our friend? He could not be sure.
Montague Rhodes James was born at the clergy house at Goodenstone, Dover in Kent in the year 1862. At the age of 3, his family moved to Great Livermere in Suffolk, where his father, a parish priest, took the living there, and where the family continued to live until the year 1909. And for Monty, he regarded this as his own natural home, because bearing in mind his life as an academic took him to many different places where he lived or travelled to, but for him, Great Livermere was always home. During his early childhood years, and which obviously laid the foundation for the man that was to be Provost of King's College, Cambridge, and Provost of Eton, he was able to immerse himself in his father's extensive private library of ancient books and manuscripts. In fact, during a period where he was ill from TB, I believe he was aged about 5, he was able to translate a Dutch Bible into English, and by the age of 12 he was able to translate ancient Ethiopic script into English. None of this had been taught to him, although I would dare to suggest that his father, who was also an academic, probably encouraged him to read and to learn more about ancient history, and particularly through these medievalist scripts. And of course he went on to become known as a famous medievalist scholar and writer. But it's another sideline perhaps that attracts us most to the legend of Montague Rhodes James, and that is as an author of ghost stories. It is said that at Great Livermere there were a number of ghosts who were present in the village, different types of hauntings that have been reported, but none more so than perhaps at the actual rectory. Monty wasn't particularly drawn for a life in the church, despite his father imploring him to do so on a number of occasions when he wrote to him while he was studying at King's College in Cambridge. The question mark obviously arises over why he decided to not take the family following into the church, and it may well have something to do with his past life, and particularly when he lived at Great Livermere Rectory. Life for young Monty in Great Livermere must have been something of a trial for him. Being a boy, he was so immersed into books and historic tradition. But he soon learnt of the local ghost tales, which involved a number of spiritual apparitions which had been seen in and around the village over the centuries. And also taking into account, it was a rather remote place to actually reside in as a child. The villagers themselves would have been perhaps part of families that have lived there for centuries, and during that period of history they would have brought forward to the present generation the lurid tales of hauntings and witchcraft which had occasioned there. And when one looks at the Brecklands, almost historically an arid wasteland which was used for strict farming on one period of history and allowed to rest and lay fallow for other years until the land could be retilled again. Monty spent a great deal of his time exploring the village, learning of the legends, and no doubt in my own mind may have come across one or two interesting incidents which have occurred there historically. But he never spoke much about his past. He never spoke about his childhood in those terms of being frightened by demonic forces or actually admitting to any level of fear. Certainly when challenged about his beliefs in the paranormal, he was quite open to the prospect of the existence of the paranormal should evidence be given to prove it. And yet here, I think, was the sleight of hand by Montague Rhodes James. I think Monty deeply believed in the paranormal. I think that he had psychic premonitions, experiences, which he was too afraid to share to fellow academia at Oxford or Cambridge or wherever he travelled, because within the academic circles for which he frequented, talk of such matters was regarded as being a little bit weird. And nonetheless, Monty was able to convey those feelings, those thoughts, those emotions, those experiences in his wonderful ghost stories. So in effect, he was writing as a third party. He was saying to them, this is not me, but these are simply ghost stories about things I thought about. But the reality is, the underlying score, which treads quietly in the background, is that Monty did actually believe in these stories. Another great tradition of his stories is the warning message, which always seems to implore people to leave well alone, to not delve into things far too deeply for things they do not understand, lest they be punished either by losing their life or by some other terrible calamity which would befall them. And also his wonderful, rich use of the English language. There are very few writers that had the vocabulary that Montague Rhodes James had in his descriptions of the examples that he gave in his stories of experiences with the paranormal. Here I am inside Plume's library in Malden in Essex, which is rather unique. It's a very ancient library dating back, I believe, to the 17th century. It benefited to the town of Malden by Thomas Plume, Esquire. And these are the kind of libraries which would have been more familiar to Montague Rhodes James in his quest to further his knowledge of ancient and scholastic works. Going back to his life, he first went to King's College, Cambridge as a student in 1882. He later became Don and then Provost. And of course, at that point, it gave him access to all of the works which were retained in the libraries, not just King's College, but also later at Eton, where he too became Provost. And one can just imagine the excitement of being able to hold and cherish these ancient tomes, to be able to find knowledge which is not perhaps more commonly known to the majority of the population, which gave him an edge. It is said that on one occasion, I believe, whilst at King's, He was actually locked into the library. He was so absorbed by his studies that the caretaker had forgotten he was still in the library. One can imagine that being locked in such an ancient building as this, for example, what kind of strange events or feelings or sensations would have been experienced by him in these lofty buildings. I too share a love for ancient books, and particularly so for these leather-bound ancient tomes that go back probably 200 or 300 years. And when you look at Monty, he was actually having access to books which dated back to the early part of the Catholic Church in the United Kingdom.
When M.R.James began his studies of medieval manuscripts and records, he was essentially alone in his interests in this field of study. While most of England had sort of moved on into this essentially whitewashed version of Christianity, which was very much cleaned up from what most people felt were these old, florid and horrid ideas from medieval Christianity of demons and devils and monsters and eternal punishment. James really continued in what was a lifelong fascination for him. And I think his fascination and isolation in this interest is reflected in his ghost stories, where you always see that scholar, that antiquarian, that archaeologist who's very much by himself in his realization that he's being pursued by some dark something that is definitely felt but unseen.
Let us then be introduced to the actors in a placid way. Let us see them going about their ordinary business, undisturbed by forebodings, pleased with their surroundings, and into this calm environment let the ominous thing put out its head, unobtrusively at first, and then more insistently until it holds the stage. For the ghost story, a slight haze of distance is desirable. 30 years ago, not long before the war, are very proper openings. If a really remote date be chosen, there is more than one way of bringing the reader in contact with it. The finding of documents about it can be made plausible, or you may begin with your apparition and go back over the years to tell the cause of it. On the whole, though not a few instances might be quoted against me, I think that a setting so modern that the ordinary reader can judge of its naturalness for himself is preferable to anything antique. I think that as a rule, the setting should be fairly familiar, and the majority of the characters in their talk, such as you may meet or hear any day, before proceeding to make a further essential point. Another requisite, in my opinion, is that the ghost should be malevolent or odious. Amiable and helpful apparitions are all very well in fairy tales or in local legends, but I have no use for them in a fictitious ghost story.
We're here at the Church of St. Peter at Wenhaston in Suffolk, and the first written record of the church's existence is found in the Domesday Survey of 1086, when it was noted that the village of Wendestuna possessed a mill, a church, and woodland sufficient to feed 16 hogs, and in fact a thriving pig farming industry remains today in the fields between Wenhaston and Southwold. In the summer of 1892, a decaying, whitewashed wooden tympanum was taken down from above the chancel arch here at Wenhaston and was left outside overnight. During that evening, a rain washed away centuries of post-Reformist whitewash, which exposed a beautiful doom painting, which was certainly last seen before the Reformation, which is believed to have been painted between 1500 and 1520. The doom depicts the day of judgment, when the dead will rise from their graves and souls will be weighed to determine if they will go to heaven or be banished to hell. The doom illustrates perfectly the medieval mindset and reminds the living of what rewards or punishments lay in wait for them according to how they lived or worshipped. But just as dooms such as this were hidden from view during the Reformation, surely many of the Reformed still felt the force of their shrouded messages, as certainly did James. Although James was a Protestant, he was clearly influenced by what he saw and discovered in his research of the early Catholic mindset, the teachings of the medieval church. Indeed, the finding of the doom here at Wenhaston is an almost Jamesian story, the washing away of the paint by God and nature, and the revelation of the hidden terror. There can be little doubt that James was aware of the uncovering of the doom, and that he would have cycled over here from Aldborough to immerse himself in all of its spiritual and artistic wonders. 2 years after the discovery of the doom, James published Canon Albrecht's scrapbook. I think in a way the substance and subject of the doom would have caused him to reflect upon his own mortality and remind him on a deeper level that some hidden secrets would only be known to God, and that in God's hands he would eventually be judged. And this set the temper for many of his tales.
At first you saw only a mass of coarse matted black hair. Presently it was seen that this covered a body of fearful thinness, almost a skeleton, but with the muscles standing out like wires. The hands were of a dusky pallor, covered like the body with long coarse hairs and hideously taloned. The eyes, touched with a burning yellow, had intensely black pupils and were fixed upon the throned king with a look of beast-like hate. Imagine one of the awful bird-catching spiders of South America translated into human form and endowed with intelligence just less than human, and you will have some faint conception of the terror inspired by the appalling effigy. One remark is universally made by those to whom I have shown the picture. It was drawn from life.
Although James spent a great deal of his academic life away from East Anglia, his spiritual home was clearly the coastal regions of Suffolk, and particularly so the environs of Aldborough and Felixstowe, described in some detail in his stories under cover of fictional names and locations. The almost abandoned and empty landscape, the hidden truths, the element of nature itself, the isolation from nearly all human contact, all were translated by James onto paper, the profound sense of the surreal intact. But if all who traverse the Suffolk coast sense a looming something crouched in these elements, it was James who coaxed it out in his stories.
It stood for the moment in a band of dark shadow, and he had not seen what its face was like. Now it began to move, in a stooping posture, and all at once the spectator realized, with some horror and some relief, that it must be blind, for it seemed to feel about it with its muffled arms in a groping and random fashion. Turning half away from him, it became suddenly conscious of the bed he had just left, and darted towards it, and bent and felt over the pillows in a way which made Parkins shudder as he had never in his life thought it possible. In a very few moments it seemed to know that the bed was empty, and then, moving forward into the area of light and facing the window, it showed for the first time what manner of thing it was.
Story tells the tale of an introverted academic who happens upon a strange whistle while exploring a Knights Templar cemetery on the East Anglian coast. When blown, the whistle unleashes a powerful supernatural force that terrorizes its discoverer. And the story was first published in 1904 in Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, the first collection of ghost stories that James published based on tales he had written at Christmas himself, for entertainment for audiences of friends and selected students at Eton and King's College, Cambridge, where he was provost. The first adaptation of this, one of James' most loved stories, was made by the BBC in 1968 and directed by Jonathan Miller and broadcast as part of the BBC Art Strand Omnibus. This production inspired new yearly productions of M.R.James's television adaptations known as A Ghost Story for Christmas, that is from 1971 to 1978, and 2005 to 2006. Both adaptations uses James's story as a basis but alter a number of key aspects of the tale, including the settings themselves. For it was on the wild beaches and in the ancient forests of Norfolk, not Suffolk, where most of the well-known adaptations have been largely filmed, a place with an atmosphere that remains today very similar to the Suffolk coast of James's time.
And now followed another little discovery. A portion of soil fell inward as he scraped and disclosed a small cavity. He lighted one match after another to help him to see of what nature the hole was, but the wind was too strong for them all. By tapping and scratching the sides with his knife, however, he was able to make out that it must be an artificial hole in masonry. It was rectangular, and the sides, top and bottom, if not actually plastered, were smooth and regular. Of course it was empty. No. As he withdrew the knife, he heard a metallic clink, and when he introduced his hand, it met with a cylindrical object lying on the floor of the hole. Naturally enough, he picked it up, and when he brought it into the light, now fast fading, he could see that it too was of man's making. A metal tube about 4 inches long and evidently of some considerable age.
Parkins, the protagonist, a sceptical Cambridge professor, is on holiday in the town of Burnstow, on the southeast coast of England. While investigating a Templar ruin for a colleague, he finds a whistle with 2 Latin inscriptions. The first inscription is biblical. Parkins translates it as, "Who it is that comes," and the second inscription means roughly, "Thief, blow, weep." Not knowing that, Parkins blows the whistle, and back at his hotel the following night, he dreams of a man fleeing towards him in a state of extreme fear and exhaustion before collapsing right in front of him. And in the distance the pursuer appears, moving in a strange fashion and with incredible speed. The next day he encounters a boy who was terrified by the white figure which had appeared at the window of Parkins' hotel room. Upon returning to his room, he notices that the room's second unused bed is in disorder. Later, while alone in his hotel room, he sees something get up from the adjacent and empty bed. The figure made up of the bedclothes attacks Parkins, but on this occasion he is saved by one of the other guests. In his introduction to Collected Ghost Stories in 1931, M.R.James stated that Burnstow in "O Whistle and I Come to You, My Lad" was based on Felixstowe in Suffolk. The golf course atop the sand dunes is still there today and complete with an original Martello tower. The Globe Inn was actually based on the Bath Hotel, where M.R.James often stayed when holidaying in Felixstowe. The Bath Hotel was built in 1839 for John Cobbold and originally called the Hamilton Hotel. It has been referred to as the Hamilton Arms, which was renamed the Bath Hotel in the 1860s. It may also have been at one time the Hamilton Temperance Hotel. The hotel burned down on April 28, 1914, after incendiary devices were planted by militant suffragettes Hilda Burkitt and Florence Tunks, who set fire to the hotel as part of their Votes for Women campaign. The hotel was empty at the time but was completely gutted. Crowds gathered for their trial at Bury Assizes on the 29th of May, where they both received prison sentences. Clearly, a lack of historical detail necessitated a number of changes to the 1968 production, and instead the focus for filming was switched from Felixstowe to mostly the Norfolk coast, at locations preferred because of its considered remoteness and natural ethereal atmospheres, a condition much loved in M.R.James's stories. We now turn to Jonathan Miller's original interpretation of this story in 1968. This adaptation itself changes a number of aspects of James's story, turning the academic described as young, neat and precise of speech into a bumbling, awkward, middle-aged eccentric. Described as a masterpiece of economical horror that remains every bit as chilling as the day it was first broadcast. A BBC press release for its repeat showing in 1969 stated that it was an unconventional adaptation, remarkable both for its uncanny sense of period and atmosphere, and for the quality of the actors' performances. In a letter to a friend's daughter some 24 years after the publication of Oh Whistle and I Come to You My Lad, James related that he had recently had a harrowing dream in which the bedclothes were pulled from him during the night by an unseen person, a ghost, an affront which he fought off with prayer against the protestations of the phantom. Was this merely a bad dream, created in the slumbering imagination of a master of literary nightmares, or perhaps not a dream at all, but the latest in James's ongoing encounters with the preternatural through his own psychic abilities? Or was it in fact a ghostly visitation? Or was this life imitating art? Had James attracted to himself through his studies and his curiosities some unnamed something, as had every one of his own unfortunate characters? A Warning to the Curious was first published in 1925 in James's A Warning to the Curious and Other Ghost Stories. The tale tells the story of Paxton, an antiquarian and archaeologist who holidays in Seaborough and inadvertently stumbles across one of the 3 lost crowns of Anglia, which legendarily protected the country from invasion. On digging the crown up, Paxton is stalked by its supernatural guardian. Written a few years after the end of the First World War, A Warning to the Curious ranks as one of M.R.James's bleakest stories. Paxton explains that he has some interest in the architecture of medieval churches. Whilst visiting one such place, he learns of a local legend about a buried Anglo-Saxon crown that protects the country from invasion. Linked to this are a deceased family called Aja, who were sworn to guard the crown. Paxton states he found the crown, but had been stalked ever since by its supernatural guardian, to the point of desperation. Both the narrator and Long are moved by Paxton's story and decide to help him return the crown. During their successful mission, both men have some appreciation of being under surveillance by a very supernatural presence. The next day, the narrator and Long are to meet Paxton for a walk, but discover him gone. A servant states that she saw Paxton running towards the beach, having heard his friends call for him. The 2 men set off after Paxton onto the beach, where a thick sea mist descends, making visibility poor. The 2 men come across Paxton's body, and he has met a violent end by the old battery next to the Martello Tower. An independent witness at a subsequent inquest absolves them of any involvement. The narrator states that they keep the location of the crown secret, finishing by saying that he has never been back or even near Seaborough since. Seaborough, described in his story, is actually the Suffolk coastal town of Aldborough. In his introduction to Collected Ghost Stories, James confirms as such. His grandmother, who died in 1873, lived there at Wyndham House, and James saw her there often, and as such had gained an intimate knowledge of the area, including certainly the local tales of the Black Shook, which had been written of in the 1891 collection Ghost and Bogey Tales of East Anglia by, strangely enough, an M.H.James.
At the north end of the town of A, almost certainly Aldborough, like the salt marshes which are sometimes full like a lake, here a favourite walk of the inhabitants leads across a sort of common planted with a fir grove by one or other of 2 paths, one of which goes through the pine woods and emerges near the station. The other leaves the pine wood on the left and skirts the mere, crossing the line and leading into a sandy lane between more pine trees. At the sea end of this waste is a kissing gate, and here it is quite likely that the presiding bogey will meet you, if you walk there after dark. The bogey is a large black dog with fiery eyes and a fierce appearance. Untold horrors befall the man or woman who persists in thwarting him.
The Bear Hotel is actually the White Line Hotel, and still very much in business, as it has been since the times of James. Inside is where the narrator and Long meets Paxton. Today the cottage is for many but an obscure ruin that lost its sense of purpose when the mere was drained many years ago. And for many it's an ugly block that is partially hidden amid bramble bushes and on a remote stretch that connects Aldborough and Thorpe Ness. Quite often the cottage isn't seen at all by the many tourists who drive past quickly, and in a way it reassures myself to the contention that James discovered it on one of his many gentle rambles by cycle. One could almost imagine the lonely cottage keeper outside chatting or waving to James, and in a way there is an indelible mark in the bones that still stand, that underscores its remoteness amid the surrounding marsh and sea, that would today still be all too familiar to James.
As I bicycled back past the churchyard wall, my eye caught a fairly new gravestone, and on it was the name of William Ager. Of course, I got off and read it. It said, "Of this parish, died at Seabrome, aged 28. There it was, you see, a little judicious questioning in the right place, and I should at least find the cottage nearest the spot. Only I didn't quite know what was the right place to begin my questioning at.
According to the writer Ronald Blythe, James was attending a service here at Peter and St Paul's Church with his grandmother when, as the national anthem was being played on the organ during a service, he suddenly burst into tears and left the church. Blythe believed that there may have been some dark and occult force at play within the church, causing him to be taken out. Of course, this story is largely apocryphal and cannot be verified, but Blythe suggests something very intriguing. Did James in fact have some type of what we call sixth sense? If so, did this ability contribute to his academic pursuits and literary imagination? What exactly did James see in the church that day here in Aldborough, and was it the first or last? At another level, we may ask, did M.R.James fear he was being punished for being involved with matters best left alone? Did James feel somehow cursed by his dark biblical pursuits and have a real fear of befalling the kind of fates he often created for his victims? Did he himself feel pursued by something and never quite alone in his own life?
It was nearly 5 o'clock. The short day was drawing in, and the church began to fill with shadows, while the curious noises, the muffled footfalls and distant talking voices that had been perceptible all day, seemed, no doubt because of the fading light and the consequentially quickened sense of hearing, to become more frequent and insistent.
Paxton, Henry Long and the narrator walk through the churchyard on their way to return the crown. The crown site where Paxton removed the crown has been suggested on geographical detail to be where the North Warren Nature Reserve is. In 1972, another story was adapted, this time by Lawrence Gordon Clark for television, as the second instalment of the BBC's A Ghost Story for Christmas strand. As with previous instalments, it was first broadcast on BBC One at 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve. It starred Peter Vaughan as Paxton, Clive Swift as Dr. Black, an amalgam of the unnamed narrator and Henry Long from the original short story, and played by John Kearney as William Ager. There are a number of differences between the film and the original short story. The film's opening sequence takes place some 12 years before Paxton's visit to Seaborough and Thruxton, as the towns are called in the adaptation, at a time when William Ager is still alive. It establishes how seriously Ager takes his role as guardian of the crown. In Clark's adaptation, you can quite well imagine the fear that Ager's character generates as he stands high over the archaeologists as some Machiavellian character, reminiscent of the statue of the dead commendatore in Mozart's production of Don Giovanni. And of course, as the unrepentant Don Giovanni was dragged off to hell, Clark's character was fittingly hacked to death with a billhook. Another example, perhaps, of James's notion to leave well enough alone. But to understand the fear of being alone in a desolate place, you firstly have to go back to an age without instant communications, or indeed the internet. In these times and places, you were alone and exposed directly to the forces of nature, a place where nobody would hear you scream, a place where your body would not be found for days or maybe weeks. These are places of isolation where the mind accentuates the sounds of the landscape, and where hidden eyes are seemingly watching with malevolent intent. Clark drew well on those senses and was able to connect the viewer into the story in a way that made some feel very vulnerable and helpless, as in the case of the archaeologist and Paxton. As with Miller's earlier production, modern Aldborough was generally unsuitable as a location to film, and so, as with Miller's choice, he instead looked towards the more remote areas of the Norfolk coast for much of his filming, of which Holcombe plays a major part.
We filmed at Holcombe Gap in North Norfolk in late February. It was consistently fine cold weather, with a slight winter haze which gave exactly the right depth and sense of mystery to the limitless vistas of the shoreline there. I tried to make Warning to the Curious as essentially a silent film, with the tension building slowly throughout the visual images. Paxton's spade strapped to his suitcase when he arrives on the train, the cutthroat razor laid along the name in the prayer book, the distant dark figure watching him wherever he goes, and above all, the great open spaces in which he stands vulnerable and alone, and then suddenly the claustrophobia of the dark hotel room where he's shut in with the demon that's scratching at his suitcase to get the crown.
M.R.James died on June the 12th, 1936, as Provost of Eton College, Berkshire. After the funeral, which was attended by past and present students, friends and staff, his body was finally laid to rest in Eton Town Cemetery. Much later, the effects of his life were cleared from his home, and among them an unpublished short ghost story, simply entitled A Vignette, and written a few months before his death, and later published in November that year in the London Mercury. By definition, a vignette in literature is a short scene that focuses on one moment that is especially powerful or significant. Though vignettes are brief, they often carry proportionately more emotion, since the author has chosen that brief moment to highlight for some important reason. The wordplay employed here is especially important, since it reveals some detail into James's childhood at the rectory in Great Livermere, upon which the story is based, and may finally lay to rest whether or not he believed in the paranormal.
Through that hole a face was looking my way. It was not monstrous, not pale, fleshless, spectral. Malevolent I thought and think it was. At any rate, the eyes were large and open and fixed. It was pink and, I thought, hot, and just above the eyes the border of a white linen drapery hung down from the brows. There is something horrifying in the sight of a face looking at one out of a frame as this did, more particularly if its gaze is unmistakably fixed upon you. Nor does it make the matter any better if the expression gives no clue to what is to come next. I said just now that I took this face to be malevolent, and so I did, but not in regard of any positive dislike or fierceness which it expressed. It was indeed quite without emotion. I was only conscious that I could see the whites of the eyes all round the pupil, and that, we know, has a glamour of madness about it. The immovable face was enough for me. I fled, but at what I thought must be a safe distance inside my own precincts. I could not but halt and look back. There was no white thing framed in the hole of the gate, but there was a draped form shambling away among the trees.
Without a doubt, this great man kept many thoughts and feelings to himself, and despite his open sociability, he was notoriously, perhaps, a very, very private person. Living as a product of the Victorian age and being a man held in high esteem by both academics and readers of his many works, he definitely erred to the side of caution, because opinions or beliefs in subjects considered best not spoken were best kept silent. Yet by his wonderfully descriptive tales there is within a knowledge that is understanding of the paranormal, and living in Victorian times it was held that there is only one ghost, which is the Holy Ghost, and the rest, therefore, are demons. After taking stock of that era's social attitudes, it certainly was a persuasive argument to keep one's opinions private and to flow with mainstream acceptability on such matters. But sadly, our journey into M.R.James has come to an end, but we hope it has provided at least an insight into his mind, and perhaps the interpretations by Miller and Clark are echoes to the landscape familiar to James, and evoke so perfectly a visualization to the writings of this great man.